During the festive Christmas season of 1927, a bizarre scene was witnessed by the townspeople of Cisco, Texas. Santa Claus himself walked into a bank, but this Santa had far more sinister intentions than spreading holiday cheer. Join us as we delve into the true crime case of the Santa Claus Bank Robbery, where Santa was hanged in public for not being a good boy this year. It's a true crime saga that defies belief, where justice was served in the most unexpected way. This is the Santa Claus Bank Robbery. On Friday, December 23, 1927, 2 days before Christmas, the streets of Cisco were shimmering with Christmas decorations of green, red, and gold. Santa Claus was walking down the main street, drawing the attention of children. But this Santa was different. He was thinner, and instead of gifts, he carried an empty burlap sack of Idaho potatoes. As Santa walked down the street, a flock of kids gathered around him. One of those kids was 6-year-old Frances Blasingame. She begged her to meet Santa. Mrs. B.P. Blasingame felt awkward, but eventually gave in to her daughter's pleas. As they started walking towards Santa, he suddenly entered the National Bank of Cisco. Mrs. Blasingame paused. Should she follow Santa into the bank? Is it appropriate? Inside the bank, a teller welcomed Santa cheerfully, but Santa ignored him. Teller assumed Santa didn't hear him and greeted him once more. Still, Santa remained silent. Suddenly, the door's bell rang and the teller saw 3 men enter. They weren't the usual customers of the bank. He knew them all. Out of nowhere, they produced pistols concealed in their coats and declared, "This is a bank robbery." Meanwhile, Mrs. Blasingame decided to follow Santa into the bank. She entered the bank with her daughter to meet Santa Claus. Little did she know that Santa was not there to spread holiday cheer. He had filled his potato sack with cash and had several pistols hanging on the belt around his waist. Panicking, Mrs. Blasingame tried to escape through the front door, but it was blocked by bank robbers. She knew her way around the bank and immediately ran through the bookkeeper's room and fled out of the back door that opened into a nearby alleyway. It all happened so quickly that the robbers could stop her or her daughter. Once safely outside, Mrs. Blasingame informed the police. Chief of Police G. Bedford wasted no time assembling his team. Armed with riot guns and joined by officers R.T. Reddies and George Carmichael, they raced towards the bank. But they weren't the only ones responding to the call for help. Local residents saw an opportunity to cash in on the dead bank robber reward program. $5,000 reward for killing a bank robber. In the United States, the 1920s are often remembered as the golden age of crime. Banks found themselves vulnerable to robberies, which were occurring at an alarming rate, often a dozen times a month. In response, the Texas Bankers Association initiated the Dead Bank Robber Reward Program. Under this scheme, anyone who shot and killed a bank robber in the act of a heist would receive a substantial cash reward of $5,000, no questions asked. But to claim the bounty, you needed to kill the robber. If he is only injured, you won't get paid. So when the citizens heard Mrs. Blasingame shouting that the bank was being robbed, they armed themselves, some retrieving firearms from their vehicles, while others rushed to a nearby hardware store, buying up every gun and round of ammunition they could lay their hands on. Remember, this is Texas. Chief Bedford barricaded the front of the bank himself. He then directed his deputies to cover the rear exit. A growing number of armed citizens joined the police, making an already dire situation even more dangerous. Inside the bank, Santa had just completed loading over $12,000 in cash and was gathering checks, bonds, and other valuables from the bank's vault, when suddenly, a single bullet shattered the front glass of the bank. Then all of a sudden, a barrage of bullets from the street wreaked havoc in the bank. Bullets ricocheted off walls and furniture. In the middle of the chaos, one of the robbers was struck by a bullet through the front window. The 4 bank robbers panicked. They gathered terrified customers and children, using them as human shields. Together, they all ran towards the rear exit. Outside, as the bandits came into view in the narrow alleyway, a gunfight broke out, creating a chaotic scene. Robbers exchanged shots with the police officers and a mob of townspeople. In their desperation, the robbers chose two young hostages, 12-year-old Laverne Comer and 10-year-old Emma Mae Robertson. They pushed them into their getaway car. The engine roared to life, and the navy blue Buick sped off, leaving behind a trail of bodies, some dead, some severely injured. Officer Rados and the townspeople of Cisco jumped into vehicles and saddled up on horseback, united in their determination to chase down the fleeing Buick. This pursuit would become the largest manhunt in the history of Texas. Inside the Buick, robbers were injured, and one of them was bleeding profusely. The gang yelled at each other in a mix of fear and urgency, while their two young hostages, Laverne and Emma, remained silent. Laverne Comer was silent for a good reason. She knew exactly who was behind the Santa Claus costume. It was none other than Marshall Ratliff, a regular diner at her mother's cafe. Marshall Ratliff had been a notorious pain in the neck since his early years. He was expelled from high school and had to find work on a farm, but he soon grew bitter about the hard labor. To make an easier living, Ratliff teamed up with his older brother, Lee, venturing into the bootlegging business. Although bootlegging seemed less demanding than farming, Ratliff wanted to make even more money with less effort. He aspired to emulate his neighbor, Old Man Yule, who was always flush with cash, despite never holding a job. When a young Ratliff asked Yule for his secret, the old man confided that he and his brother had successfully robbed a bank in their youth, setting them up for life. Inspired by Yule, in 1926, Marshall and his brother, Lee Ratliff, robbed a bank in Valera, Coleman County. They made off with over $3,000, but were later arrested by the police. The Ratliff brothers were sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment in the Huntsville State Penitentiary. But a few citizens believed the brothers deserved a second chance. They rallied for their release, and their mother appealed to the governor and sweetened the deal with a generous donation. Eventually, they were granted a pardon and set free. Remember, this was Texas in the 1920s. Following their release, Marshall and Lee Ratliff went their separate ways. Lee restarted his bootlegging, but Marshall fixated on his failure. He meticulously dissected everything that had gone wrong in the bank robbery. He believed he had learned from his mistakes and had it all figured out. All he needed were some capable partners to rob a bank again. Search for employment took Marshall Ratliff to Wichita. It was an oil field where he saw a familiar face from his days in the Huntsville Penitentiary, Robert Hill. Hill, orphaned at the age of 10, had been convicted for a tailor shop robbery. He insisted that he took the fall to save his partners. Loyalty was a trait Marshall valued deeply. Ratliff and Hill became friends behind bars. And now, as free men, they found themselves casually working together in the oil fields. Unknown to him, Hill became the first member to join Ratliff in the bank robbery gang. As fate would have it, they were soon joined by yet another former inmate from the Huntsville Penitentiary, Henry Helms. Unlike Ratliff and Hill, Helms was considerably older, in his 30s. With a lengthy criminal record and an imposing physical presence, Helms was a man most people went out of their way to avoid. Desperate to make ends meet, he came to work in oil fields. Unknown to him either, Helms became the second member to join Ratliff in the bank robbery gang. The three men struck up a friendship, and together, they decided to leave behind the basic bunkhouse they shared with fellow oil field workers. They chose more comfortable accommodations in a boarding house that was run by Mitch Teller, a nice old woman who treated them as if they were her own sons. Marshall Ratliff, ever the planner, eventually unveiled his audacious scheme to his friends. He wanted to rob the First National Bank of Cisco during the busy Christmas season, when the bank would hold a huge amount of money. Ratliff had it all planned out. He would escape through the back door that opened directly into the alleyway. In his mind, the robbery would be a quick in-and-out job. Walk in through the front door, point a gun at an employee until they handed over the money, and then make a quiet exit out the back. But the other men were not so optimistic. They reminded Ratliff of his previous failed attempt. Besides, how could they forget the $5,000 reward for killing a bank robber? But Ratliff was confident. He knew all banks were insured, and expert bank robbers rarely get caught. He assumed that civilians wouldn't confront armed bandits. After much convincing, Helms and Hill reluctantly saw eye to eye with Ratliff. The trio spent countless evenings meticulously planning the heist. Marshall Ratliff knew precisely where each member needed to position themselves, while he collected the money from the safe and vault. They were only missing one crucial piece: the fourth member of their crew, an individual experienced with firearms if things went south. In their search for the fourth member, Helms proposed a candidate, a man named Lewis Davis. Davis had no criminal record. He was young with a large family to support. While Ratliff and Hill were initially hesitant, but eventually agreed to meet with him. Davis looked like he could get the job done, so he was brought into their plan. On Thursday, December 22, 1927, the day before the planned robbery, Ratliff had one crucial agenda. While the other three men were not from Cisco, everybody knew Ratliff around town, including the local police chief. Mitch Teller agreed to let Ratliff borrow her homemade Santa costume. This Santa Claus disguise was of utmost importance. The last piece of the puzzle was securing the getaway vehicle. None of the men owned a car, so they roamed the streets and stole a navy blue Buick, with the keys conveniently left in the ignition and a full tank of gas. The stage was set for their audacious plan to unfold. In the early hours of December 23, 1927, the four men embarked on their 150-mile journey to Cisco in the navy blue Buick. Ratliff knew the names of the bank employees who were likely to be on duty that day. He anticipated there wouldn't be many customers inside the bank when they arrived. As the group arrived in Cisco, Ratliff instructed Hill to park the Buick near the end of the alleyway for their getaway. Helms, Hill, and Davis blended into the crowd outside the bank. Meanwhile, Ratliff donned his Santa suit disguise. Despite his meticulous planning, Ratliff hadn't considered the attention the Santa suit might attract from local children. Instead of blending in with the Christmas shoppers, it drew unwanted interest, and several children followed him into the bank. The bank turned out to be busier than expected, but Ratliff remained unfazed, waiting for the arrival of his three accomplices. When the teller greeted him, he stayed silent out of fear that the teller would recognize his voice. Once Helms, Hill, and Davis entered the bank, the heist began. Ratliff quickly filled his burlap sack with cash and bonds while the others stood guard. Hill yelled at a woman and her young daughter, who attempted to escape through the bookkeeper's office, but a noise outside distracted him. The front window was shattered. A group of local men had formed a blockade in front of the bank with guns drawn. When the first gunshot shattered the window, chaos erupted, and the mob closed in on the bank. Hill fired warning shots into the ceiling in an attempt to appear armed and dangerous, but his warning was met with a hail of gunfire. Davis was struck multiple times in the crossfire. Helms noticed two young girls, 12-year-old Laverne Comer and 10-year-old Emma Mae Robertson, cowering near the counter. He decided to use them as human shields. In chaos, Ratliff, too, was struck by a bullet. To protect innocent bystanders, the police ordered the vigilant mob to cease fire. As soon as the firing stopped, Helms emerged from the rear door, shielded by his two young hostages. Ratliff seized Laverne and Emma Mae from Helms and bundled them into the Buick. The four robbers hurriedly climbed into the vehicle and sped away. Police Chief Bedford took aim and fired at the Buick. Helms leaned out of the Buick's window, aimed his gun at Chief Bedford, and fired 5 shots. Police Chief Bedford and Officer George Carmichael lay mortally wounded, and 6 civilians were badly injured. The bank itself was riddled with more than 200 bullet holes, making it nearly impossible to determine who was responsible for the injuries. Given their head start, the Buick should have easily outrun its pursuers, but the car's fuel tank was nearly empty after driving a couple of 100 miles. The robbers pulled over. They now face another major problem: low on fuel. They all felt hopeless until a brand new Oldsmobile carrying the Harris family stopped when Santa waved at them for help. Ratliff raised his gun at them, and they surrendered and fled the scene. The robbers quickly shifted into the Oldsmobile, but turns out the Harris family ran away with the car keys. They hopped back in the Buick and drove off in search of another car. They had to leave behind Davis in the Oldsmobile. He was seriously injured and unconscious. The vigilant group chasing them eventually discovered the abandoned Oldsmobile, with Lewis Davis bleeding in the backseat. Lewis Davis was the first one to be arrested. He was transported to Fort Worth Hospital. When Davis regained consciousness, the police demanded that he reveal the names of his accomplices. However, before he could confess, Lewis Davis succumbed to his injuries and lost his life. Meanwhile, the vigilantes, motivated by a $15,000 bounty, kept looking. Ratliff, Hill, and Helms left the Buick when it ran out of gas and spent the night hiding in the woods. When morning broke, they resorted to stealing yet another car and drove in the opposite direction of the search parties. But Texas Ranger Sam Bradford had set up an ambush at South Bend. He was certain that the fugitives would pass through this area. Texas Ranger Sam Bradford positioned himself in the middle of the oil field, armed with just a shotgun and 3 cartridges. He would only need 3 to stop the 3 fugitives in their tracks. A faint echo of boots disturbing the shrubs reached his ears. 3 figures moved hesitantly through the field. Amongst them, Bradford clearly spotted weak and exhausted Marshall Ratliff across the field. He didn't hesitate. He aimed and pulled the trigger. With practiced precision, he reloaded and fired at Henry Helms. His final cartridge was spent on Robert Hill. All 3 projectiles hit their targets. Ratliff was captured on the spot. He had sustained 6 gunshot wounds, including 1 to the jaw. Despite being shot, Hill and Helms managed to run into the woods. They hid there for 2 days, but eventually, searchers were able to track their footprints, and on December 30th, 1927, Robert Hill and Henry Helms were finally captured in the North Texas city of Graham and taken into custody. By the time they were arrested, 1 week had passed since the men had entered the First National Bank in Cisco. The largest manhunt in Texas had finally come to an end. Ratliff, Hill, and Helms were tried separately. Robert Hill represented himself and was sentenced to 99 years in prison for armed robbery. In prison, he managed to escape 3 times, but he was recaptured each time. He then became a model prisoner and worked towards securing his release through more honest means. Henry Helms, the shooter responsible for killing Cisco's chief of police and his colleague officer George Carmichael, was sentenced to death by the electric chair. In an attempt to avoid the death penalty, Helms uselessly tried to convince everyone that he was insane. Marshall Ratliff was identified as the ringleader, but since nobody had seen him fire a single shot, he could only be convicted of armed robbery. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Ratliff was delighted and felt he could do his time easily, knowing that a model prisoner could be released from a life sentence in as little as 20 years. The enraged public demanded a retrial, and the authorities agreed. During Ratliff's second trial, the prosecution still couldn't find any witnesses willing to testify that they had seen him fire a single shot. Nonetheless, they found him guilty of involvement in the murders of Chief Bedford and Officer Carmichael, and Ratliff was sentenced to join Helms on death row. Helms's insanity plea fell on deaf ears, and on September 6, 1929, nearly 2 years after the bank robbery, Henry Helms was dragged kicking and screaming to his execution in the electric chair. He was put to death. Ratliff began acting insane on the day of Helms's execution. He began behaving oddly in hopes of an insanity plea. While waiting for his insanity hearing appealed by his mother, Ratliff suffered paralysis, and the prison guards had to physically lift him out of bed to feed him. Deputy Sheriff Tom Jones, a 53-year-old father of 8, took on the responsibility of caring for Ratliff. He fed him and bathed him, as well as helped him use the bathroom. By Monday, November 18, 1929, Ratliff was paralyzed for 10 days. That night, as Deputy Sheriff Jones and his colleague, Pat Kilbourne, prepared to feed Ratliff, they left the door to his cell open. Ratliff had been faking the symptoms of paralysis all along. He slipped out of his cell, and he found a service revolver on the sheriff's desk. Ratliff tried to escape, but came across Deputy Sheriff Jones coming down the stairs. Ratliff shot at Deputy Jones 3 times, causing life-threatening injuries. Pat Kilbourne heard the gunfire and came running. Ratliff shot at him too, but the shots missed, and Kilbourne tackled him to the ground. Kilbourne pounded him to the pulp, knocking him unconscious. Ratliff was captured and taken back to his cell. Deputy Sheriff Tom Jones died from the wounds. On November 19, 1929, the day after Ratliff's failed escape attempt, a furious mob of approximately 2,000 men, women, and children descended upon the jail where he was imprisoned. Pat Kilbourne pleaded with the crowd, urging them to return and allow the courts to do their job. However, the enraged mob overpowered Kilbourne and seized Ratliff. They stripped him naked and dragged him outside the jail. The unruly crowd paraded Ratliff through the streets, past the Majestic Theater, where a production called The Noose was ironically playing. The procession came to a halt on a well-lit main street. One man in the mob tied a hemp rope into a noose and secured it tightly around Ratliff's neck. It was then tossed over a nearby utility pole. A dozen men took hold of the rope and hoisted Ratliff into the air. The sudden jerk of the rope was so violent that it broke, causing him to tumble to the ground. The crowd, fueled by anger and vengeance, began chanting, "String him up! String him up!" Ratliff was once again raised, this time more slowly, and just before his feet left the ground, he managed to utter his final words, "Forgive me, boys." This marked the tragic end of Ratliff's life, etching a chapter in history. Santa Claus Bank Robbery stands as an unbelievable true crime case that weaves together foolish daydreaming, rebellious bounty hunting, relentless manhunt, and ultimately, mob justice. This is just one of many stories waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe now so you don't miss out on our upcoming videos, and please like the video if you enjoyed it. Goodbye, until the next crime.